he changed the face of a nation with a single decision. Married 6 times, broke with the church, and ruled with iron and fear. But who was he really? A tyrant, a visionary, or simply a man caught in the storm of history? This is not just the story of a king. It's the unraveling of a myth that has haunted English history for 5 centuries. You've heard the tales of Anne Boleyn's fall, of bloody executions, of royal ambition. But what if you've only seen the surface, you? In this 12-part series, we go beyond the crown, beyond the portrait and palace walls, to uncover the complex mind, the shifting politics, and the broken relationships that shaped one of the most controversial monarchs in history. This is Henry VIII. The king, out the man, zou betouwde the myth, Zaki. Part 1. The making of a prince. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. Before he became the most infamous king in English history, Henry VIII was merely a second son destined for a life in the shadow of his elder brother Arthur. Born on 28th June 1491 at Greenwich Palace, Henry Tudor entered a world shaped by ambition, diplomacy, and the cautious legacy of his father, Henry VII. He was not expected to rule, and this allowed him a childhood less burdened by the weight of kingship and more enriched with learning, arts, and chivalry. Henry's early years were steeped in the humanist ideals of the Renaissance, a movement embraced by his tutors and mentors who saw in him a mind of great promise. He studied Latin, theology, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and languages, with a particular interest in history and classical literature. Unlike many royal sons, he was not trained primarily for warfare, but was molded as a scholar and courtly gentleman. This grounding in intellectual pursuit would remain with him for life, influencing not only his governing style, but also his sense of divine authority and personal entitlement. Henry's education, though rich in content, was also filled with contradictions that would later define his reign. He was taught to obey the church, yet also to reason independently. He read the Bible, but also devoured ancient Roman texts that emphasized power, will, and statecraft. His mother, Elizabeth of York, provided him with a sense of Plantagenet legitimacy, while his father's lineage rooted him firmly in the victorious Lancastrian cause. These conflicting legacies merged within the young prince, giving him both the pride of inheritance and the paranoia of a usurper's son. Arthur, Prince of Wales, was groomed meticulously for kingship and political alliance, particularly through his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess and daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Henry, meanwhile, was raised in the knowledge that he would likely serve the church or become a noble patron with lands and influence, but no crown. This allowed him a certain freedom of character. He was athletic, vibrant, musical, and theatrical, far removed from the austere public image he would later project. He enjoyed jousting, hunting, composing songs, and playing instruments, often surrounded by a circle of companions who admired his wit and charm. The young Henry was every inch the Renaissance prince, cultivated and graceful, with an air of superiority that stemmed from both breeding and ability. But destiny intervened in April 1502, when Arthur died suddenly at Ludlow Castle, possibly from sweating sickness. The Tudor dynasty was still new and fragile, and the loss of the heir put tremendous pressure on the remaining male child. Overnight, Henry was catapulted from secondary status to the precarious position of future king. His education was immediately recalibrated to suit a monarch's future, though some of the essential groundwork had already been laid. His life became more controlled, more monitored, and more politically significant in every way. Henry VII, a calculating and fiscally cautious monarch, now faced the challenge of preserving the Tudor legacy through his surviving son. To strengthen alliances and maintain continuity, plans began to form for Henry to marry his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. But such a union required a special papal dispensation due to church laws against marrying a deceased brother's wife. Although the engagement was formalized, Henry VII hesitated, partly for financial reasons and partly due to his ever-watchful political instincts. During this period, Henry was kept largely out of the public eye, away from courtly intrigue and under strict supervision at Richmond and Eltham. He continued to learn diplomacy, statecraft, and legal theory, while also being taught the dangers of rebellion, betrayal, and court factionalism. Henry's relationship with his father was complex. He admired the older king's accomplishments, but was clearly shaped by the austere and suspicious atmosphere that dominated Henry VII's final years. This environment of caution, calculation, and controlled court politics would deeply influence Henry VIII's future methods of governance, even if he would later contrast it with bursts of extravagance and cruelty. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son ascended the throne at age 17, a towering figure of charm, confidence, and promise. He was tall, handsome, and magnificently educated, with a vision of kingship drawn as much from mythic heroes as from real rulers. The early Henry VIII embodied hope for a new era, a break from the cautious penny-pinching of his father's reign. But within that youthful prince already lay the seeds of the man he would become, ambitious, prideful, contradictory, and utterly convinced of his divine role in shaping England's fate. His early life gave him a love of learning, but also a taste for domination, a mix of courtly honor and ruthless pragmatism. These twin impulses would guide his rule for nearly 4 decades, during which time the Prince of Promise would evolve into the King of Legend. To understand Henry VIII, the myth, one must first understand Henry the boy, groomed in uncertainty and crowned in expectation. The prince who was never meant to rule would become the monarch who reshaped a kingdom. And that transformation began in the cradle, beneath the heavy gaze of dynastic survival and personal ambition. Part 2. The Accidental King. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. When Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, few could have predicted the storm he would unleash upon England. At just 17 years old, the young king was hailed as the Golden Prince, vibrant, handsome, and full of promise. But beneath the surface of celebration, his rise to power was neither planned nor prepared in the way most monarchs experience. Henry had not spent his childhood in expectation of rule, and so he ascended the throne as an accidental king, shaped by sudden opportunity rather than long-term design. That fact would shape the impulsive and often unpredictable decisions that followed throughout his reign. Unlike his elder brother Arthur, whose life had been steeped in the politics and pressures of succession, Henry's youth was relatively insulated from the burdens of kingship. Though richly educated and personally gifted, he had not been trained to govern in the methodical fashion favored by his father. Henry VII had carefully restricted his son access to power and surrounded him with loyal servants and watchful eyes. As a result, when Henry VIII became king, he arrived with limited political experience but boundless confidence. His early rule was therefore an expression of youthful exuberance rather than cautious statecraft. One of his first acts as king was to distance himself from the unpopular advisors of his father. He ordered the arrest and execution of Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, 2 of Henry VII's chief financial enforcers, in a bold move to assert his independence. This early purge set a precedent that would become common in his reign, the swift removal of those who stood in the way of his vision or popularity. The executions were not merely political, they were symbolic, announcing to the realm that a new era had begun, one that would contrast dramatically with the frugality and suspicion of his predecessor. Henry positioned himself as a Renaissance monarch, lavish, generous, chivalrous, and open to flattery. He surrounded himself with young courtiers who matched his vitality and flair, men like Charles Brandon and Thomas Boleyn, who helped fuel the exuberance of a court that pulsed with energy and ambition. He also leaned heavily on older, more experienced figures, particularly Thomas Wolsey, who would soon become one of the most powerful men in England. Wolsey's administrative genius allowed Henry to focus on the aspects of kingship he most enjoyed: tournaments, hunting, music, and diplomacy. Yet even in these early days, Henry revealed flashes of intensity, pride, and a growing sense of divine authority that hinted at darker turns to come. He believed deeply in the sanctity of monarchy and viewed himself not just as England's ruler, but as God's chosen representative on earth. This belief was strengthened when he married Catherine of Aragon just 2 months after his coronation. Their union was politically advantageous, reaffirming England's alliance with Spain and honoring the commitment made by his father. But for Henry, it also offered a sense of legitimacy and continuity. Marrying his brother's widow created a symbolic link between the old king and the new. The couple's coronation was a dazzling affair, filled with music, pageantry, and celebration that reflected the kingdom's optimism. In those early years, Henry and Catherine were widely adored, embodying the hope of a stable and glorious future for the Tudor dynasty. As king, Henry was determined to live out the ideals of chivalry he had read about in childhood. He participated in jousts, hosted lavish banquets, and promoted courtly love as a central feature of his court's culture. His physical prowess was legendary. He was over 6 feet tall, well-muscled, and skilled in martial contests, earning admiration from foreign ambassadors and nobles alike. But more than physicality, Henry craved recognition as a warrior king on the European stage. He envisioned himself as a second Henry V, destined to revive England's martial glory in France and secure a legacy of conquest and valor. This desire led to his first foreign campaign in 1513, when he invaded northern France with the support of the Holy League. Though the military gains were limited, the campaign satisfied his ego and provided the spectacle he craved. Henry saw war as a tool of personal and national affirmation, not merely political strategy. Yet even at this early point, it was clear that Henry's ambitions would not always align with reality. He had a grand sense of self, but not yet the temperament or administrative acumen to manage the complexity of rule alone. Much of the actual governance fell to Wolsey, whose ability to carry out royal whims gave Henry the illusion of control without the burden of daily decision-making. This dynamic allowed Henry to remain distant from the intricacies of law, tax, and diplomacy, focusing instead on performance and grandeur. But it also laid the foundation for future conflicts, as the king's reliance on others masked his own growing will to rule absolutely. The accidental king had assumed the throne with little preparation, but each year he grew more convinced that his instincts were infallible. What began as charming confidence would eventually evolve into a dangerous belief in personal destiny above all else. The first decade of Henry's reign was marked by celebration and spectacle, but also by the quiet tightening of royal power. Even when delegating responsibility, Henry remained the center of gravity at court. His moods, passions, and desires shaped every decision and outcome. His unpredictability became a source of fascination and fear, a trait that would define his relationships with wives, ministers, and foreign rulers alike. From the moment he inherited the throne, Henry VIII was determined to make his reign unforgettable. What no one could foresee was how far he would go to ensure that goal. Part 3. The Warrior King's Dream. Henry VIII, the King, the Man, the Myth. Henry VIII believed he was destined to be a warrior king in the image of his great medieval predecessors. He was particularly drawn to the legend of Henry V, who had conquered at Agincourt and left a lasting imprint on English pride. From an early age, Henry was obsessed with the ideals of chivalry, martial glory, and the grandeur of battle. He saw himself as a new Arthur or Alexander, commanding not just armies, but admiration across Christendom. War to Henry was not merely policy, it was performance, legacy, and divine right expressed in armor and steel. In 1513, Henry finally had the chance to prove his worth on the battlefield. With the support of Pope Julius II and the Holy League, Henry led an English expedition across the Channel to fight the French in northern France. The campaign, although modest in scale, was successful enough to feed Henry's appetite for glory. At the Battle of the Spurs, English cavalry routed a French force in a brief skirmish that Henry exaggerated into a decisive victory. The king reveled in the praise and pageantry that followed, commissioning artworks and ballads to immortalize the moment. While the gains were minimal, only a few towns like Terouanne and Tournai were captured. The war was useful in other ways. It gave Henry a taste of international politics and elevated England's status, if only temporarily, among the great powers of Europe. It also allowed him to present himself as an equal to Emperor Maximilian and King Ferdinand of Aragon, whose support he craved and envied. Henry was no longer the second son or inexperienced heir. He was now a crowned warrior, blessed by battle and adored by his people. But despite his ambitions, Henry would never again command in the field with such personal enthusiasm. Military campaigns were costly and logistically difficult, particularly for a kingdom as economically modest as England. Each war strained the royal treasury and tested the limits of domestic patience. More importantly, they revealed a contradiction in Henry's rule. His thirst for martial greatness often conflicted with the practical needs of governance. As the years passed, this tension would define his foreign policy, swinging between aggression and diplomacy depending on mood and opportunity. Henry remained fascinated by war, but increasingly relied on others to execute the details, distancing himself from the brutal consequences of his dreams. One of the defining events of Henry's early reign came in 1520, with the extravagant summit known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Held between Henry VIII and Francis I of France, it was a spectacle of unbelievable opulence, complete with golden tents, feasts, and tournaments. Ostensibly a diplomatic meeting meant to foster peace, the event was in truth a contest of grandeur between two rival kings. Henry, dressed in shimmering fabrics and displaying his athletic prowess in jousts and wrestling matches, aimed to outshine his French counterpart. Yet the outcome was politically empty. No lasting alliance emerged, and the two monarchs remained wary competitors on the European stage. Behind this theatre of diplomacy stood the figure of Thomas Wolsey, Henry's trusted advisor and the chief architect of foreign policy during these years. Wolsey navigated the shifting alliances of Europe with skill, often acting as a counterbalance to Henry's more impulsive desires. But the king's focus was always on glory. He wanted conquests, not compromises, triumphs, not treaties. He dreamed of reclaiming England's ancient claims in France, reviving a past long out of reach in the new realities of 16th century power. That dream, however, was a heavy burden, and one that England's economy and manpower could rarely afford to pursue in earnest. By the mid-1520s, Henry began to feel the limits of his military ambitions. VIII. France and the Holy Roman Empire had grown stronger, and the delicate balance of power made grand campaigns increasingly risky. Domestically, the costs of war were becoming unpopular, with Parliament and the nobility resisting new levies and forced loans. Despite these pressures, Henry clung to the idea that he was meant to lead England to martial greatness. His pride could not bear the thought of irrelevance or the suggestion that England was a second-rate power. This need for glory would resurface repeatedly, shaping his actions in Ireland, Scotland, and even through naval expansions. He poured resources into shipbuilding, creating a permanent royal navy that would eventually become a symbol of English strength. The construction of ships like the Mary Rose marked a turning point, not just in military capability, but in the assertion of England as a sea power. While his land campaigns were sporadic and often underwhelming, his investments at sea laid the foundations for future English dominance. Even here, however, the line between vision and vanity remained thin. Henry's desire to be a warrior king never truly faded, though it was increasingly expressed through pageantry, symbols, and memory rather than actual conquest. He crafted an image of himself as a triumphant monarch, regardless of the practical results of his campaigns. Art, literature, and ceremony helped perpetuate this myth, paintings showing him in armor, coins with imperial titles, and songs glorifying his strength. He became his own legend, curating a version of history where each battle, treaty, and display confirmed his greatness. In truth, his military record was uneven, but Henry's belief in his destiny remained untouched by such realities. Even as setbacks mounted, he never stopped seeing himself as the rightful heir to medieval greatness. The myth of the warrior king had taken root, not just in Henry's mind, but in the hearts of many who feared or admired his boldness. Yet that myth would come at a cost, as ambition led to overreach and dreams collided with the hard ground of political consequence. Henry VIII wanted to be remembered forever as a conqueror of men and nations. But his true battles were only beginning, and they would soon take place not on the battlefield, but in his court, his conscience, and his marriage bed. Part 4. The Great Matter and the Break from Rome. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. By the late 1520s, Henry VIII's pursuit of glory took a turn inward, away from foreign conquests and into the heart of his own dynasty. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one surviving child, Princess Mary. The absence of a male heir began to gnaw at Henry's legacy, feeding a growing anxiety that the Tudor line might crumble without a son. But what began as a personal dilemma soon escalated into a crisis of religion, power, and royal authority. This was the beginning of what Henry would call his Great Matter. Henry had once been a devoted son of the Catholic Church, even earning the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, from the Pope for his attacks on Martin Luther. But that loyalty was conditional, rooted more in Henry's desire for control than in pure theology. When Catherine failed to bear him a male heir, Henry became convinced that their union had been cursed by God. He cited a verse from Leviticus that warned of childlessness when a man marries his brother's widow. To Henry, this was divine proof that his marriage was invalid, despite the Pope's earlier dispensation that had allowed it in the first place. The woman who now captured Henry's interest was Anne Boleyn, a sharp, ambitious, and politically astute member of the court. Unlike Catherine, Anne refused to become his mistress and instead insisted on marriage, promising Henry the son he so desperately needed. What began as infatuation soon turned into obsession, and Henry's entire court became consumed by the question of annulment. Cardinal Wolsey, once the king's most trusted advisor, was tasked with securing papal approval to end the marriage. But the Pope, caught between powerful political forces, delayed and hesitated, leaving Henry increasingly furious and impatient. Wolsey's failure to deliver the annulment spelled his downfall. Only, by 1529, Henry had stripped him of his offices and wealth, accusing him of praemunire, placing papal authority above the king's. Wolsey died in disgrace, a broken man, his fall signaling a new direction in Henry's reign. In place of churchmen, Henry turned to secular counselors like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, men who understood that the king's will must be absolute. The Great Matter was no longer just about love or heirs. It had become a battle for supremacy between Henry and Rome. Cromwell, a legal and political genius, proposed a radical solution. If the Pope would not grant an annulment, then Henry should simply remove papal authority from England altogether. This idea was revolutionary and dangerous, but it gave Henry what he craved most: control. By 1533, with Cranmer now Archbishop of Canterbury, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn, and Cranmer declared his union with Catherine null and void. That same year, Anne was crowned queen, and soon after she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Though not the male heir Henry desired, the political die had been cast. The break from Rome was formalized in 1534 with the Act of Supremacy, declaring Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. It was one of the most momentous decisions in English history, transforming the kingdom's religious structure, its legal system, and its relationship with the rest of Europe. The Reformation in England did not begin with a desire for theological purity, as it had in Germany or Switzerland. Instead, it was born from royal ambition, dynastic fear, and Henry's desire to govern his kingdom without interference. The result was a hybrid faith, outwardly Catholic in ritual, but ruled entirely by the crown, not the Pope. The consequences of this break were immense. Monasteries across England were dissolved, their lands and treasures seized and redistributed to loyal nobles and royal coffers. Religious houses that had stood for centuries were dismantled in a matter of years, their communities scattered and their influence erased. The dissolution of the monasteries, driven by Cromwell and sanctioned by Henry, reshaped England's landscape and economy. It also fueled resentment, leading to uprisings such as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, which Henry crushed with brutal efficiency. Opposition to the king's religious revolution was met with ruthless force. Prominent figures like Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, who refused to recognize Henry's supremacy, were executed for treason. Henry justified these acts as necessary for national unity, but they revealed a darker edge to his rule, where dissent, even from friends, was punished with death. His image as the defender of the faith was now bitterly ironic, as he wielded religious power not for salvation, but for sovereignty. England had become a nation divided between old loyalties and new doctrines, between faith and fear. For Henry, the break with Rome was not just about religion, it was about legacy. He wanted to establish a dynasty that would endure, one that would be remembered not only for military conquest, but for reshaping the very soul of the nation. Though the move would have profound consequences long after his death, at the time it appeared to solve his immediate crisis. But, with Anne by his side and papal influence cast aside, Henry believed his throne and his lineage were now secure. But the myth of control was fleeting, and even as he seized religious power, new challenges loomed on the horizon. The great matter had been settled by royal decree, but the price was heavy. England was torn from its spiritual moorings, and Henry's rule had become more authoritarian, more suspicious, and more volatile. The man who had once styled himself a chivalric prince had become something far more dangerous, a king who believed his will was divine law. The break from Rome was not just a turning point in English history, it was the moment Henry VIII became something larger than life. As no longer merely a king, he was now a myth in motion, shaping a nation in his image, for better or for worse. Part 5. Anne Boleyn, Rise, Ruin, and Royal Reckoning. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. Anne Boleyn's ascent to the throne was unlike anything England had witnessed before. She was not a foreign princess, nor the product of a grand dynastic alliance. She was the daughter of a well-placed but relatively minor courtier, Thomas Boleyn, and her rise came not through diplomacy, but through seduction, wit, and iron will. Anne captivated Henry VIII with her intelligence and refusal to be just another mistress. She played the long game, resisting him until he offered her the ultimate prize, marriage and a crown. Her coronation in 1533 was a dazzling affair, filled with pageantry and the promise of a new era. But beneath the silk and trumpets, tension simmered. Many still viewed Catherine of Aragon as the true queen, and Anne as an interloper who had shattered England's spiritual unity for her own gain. The public, particularly the deeply Catholic North, whispered of Anne's arrogance, her French manners, and her role in the break from Rome. From the beginning, she ruled under a cloud of suspicion and hostility. Anne knew her position was fragile. To secure her place, she had to produce a male heir. But her first child, born shortly after her coronation, was a girl, Princess Elizabeth. Though Henry masked his disappointment with a veneer of optimism, the absence of a son reignited his old anxieties. Anne's miscarriages and stillbirths that followed were met not with sympathy, but with growing frustration from the king. The very crown that had been built for her now felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Anne was politically astute and had once shared Henry's vision of religious reform, supporting the rise of Protestant voices and the destruction of monastic institutions. But in the court's shifting tides, her enemies multiplied. Cromwell, once her ally, began to see her influence as a threat to his control of the government and the church. Her outspoken nature, sharp tongue, and refusal to conform to the traditional image of a submissive queen alienated many at court. Soon Henry began to drift away emotionally, turning his attentions to one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. In 1536, a final devastating blow came when Anne suffered another miscarriage. This time, the fetus was male. Henry, convinced now that God had turned against this union too, saw it as a divine sign that the marriage was cursed. His affection turned to cold indifference, and from there, to contempt. Anne's fate was sealed not just by biology, but by political calculation and royal fatigue, to remove her, Henry needed a justification that would not stain his divine authority. Enter Thomas Cromwell. In a series of swift and shocking accusations, Anne was charged with adultery, incest, and treason. Among the accused were 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were flimsy, the evidence nearly non-existent, but the trial was a performance designed for a single outcome: execution. Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had once celebrated her triumphal entry as queen. In May 1536, Anne stood before a jury of her peers, most of whom were carefully chosen to ensure a guilty verdict. She defended herself with dignity and eloquence, but it mattered little. Her conviction was preordained. Just days later, George Boleyn and the other accused men were executed. Then, on May 19th, Anne herself was beheaded by a skilled French swordsman, an unusual mercy granted by Henry to minimize her suffering. Anne's fall was breathtaking in its speed and brutality. Within days of her death, Henry became engaged to Jane Seymour. To the court, it was clear that Anne had simply outlived her usefulness. But to England, the queen who had once altered the nation's destiny was now reduced to a cautionary tale of ambition, misstep, and royal betrayal. Her legacy, however, would not vanish with her body. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, would one day rise to the throne and become one of England's greatest monarchs. Yet at the time, her mother's memory was quietly erased, her portraits removed, her name avoided. Henry never spoke of Anne again. In official records, she was often referred to as the late queen or that woman. It was as if the man who had defied a continent to marry her had never known her at all. Anne Boleyn was more than a tragic figure. She was a catalyst for England's religious and political transformation. Her marriage to Henry marked a new age of royal supremacy and the reshaping of English identity. But she also became a victim of the same forces she helped unleash, caught in the web of male power, dynastic pressure, and a king's impossible expectations. In Henry's mythos, she was both Eve and scapegoat, desired, blamed, and discarded when inconvenient. Her ghost haunted the Tudor court for years, not only in memory, but in warning. To love Henry VIII was to gamble with fate. To defy him was to invite destruction. Anne's story, brief as it was in years, stands as one of the most revealing chapters in Henry's reign, a mirror of his desires, fears, and thirst for control. In her rise and ruin, the man and the myth of Henry VIII converged with violent clarity. Part 6. The Fall of Thomas More, Conscience versus Crown. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. Thomas More was once one of Henry VIII's most trusted advisors. A man of intellect, integrity, and deep Catholic faith, he had risen through the ranks not by force or fortune, but by the weight of his mind and moral compass. More was a scholar, lawyer, and writer, most famously the author of Utopia, a visionary work that imagined an ideal society guided by reason and justice. Henry admired him not just as a counselor, but as a friend, calling him a man for all seasons long before the phrase entered popular legend. But as Henry's personal and political priorities began to shift, so too did the foundations of their friendship. More had supported reforms within the church, but not the wholesale destruction of its authority. As Henry sought to break from Rome in order to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, More found himself increasingly at odds with the king. He could not accept the notion that a monarch could assume supremacy over spiritual matters. To More, the Pope was not just a foreign figurehead, but the divine custodian of Christian truth. The idea that Henry could declare himself head of the Church of England was a step too far, a sacrilege masked as sovereignty. In 1532, sensing the storm to come, More resigned as Lord Chancellor, citing health reasons but making his conscience clear. It was a rare act of defiance from someone so close to the center of power. More hoped his quiet withdrawal would shield him from conflict, allowing him to live in private without openly opposing the king. But in Henry's England, silence could be just as damning as speech. To refuse to affirm the king's supremacy was to question his very authority, and that Henry could not abide. By 1534, the Act of Supremacy was in place, and every subject was required to take an oath acknowledging the king as the supreme head of the Church of England. More refused. He did not speak out against the act publicly, nor did he try to rally resistance. Instead, he remained silent, believing that his refusal to sign was a private matter between his soul and his God. But to Henry, that silence was treason in disguise. More was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he would spend over a year in increasingly grim conditions. Inside the tower, More continued to write, penning letters filled with philosophical reflection and quiet strength. His correspondence with his daughter, Margaret Roper, reveals the torment of a man torn between earthly duty and eternal truth. He clung to his beliefs with humility, never denouncing the king directly, but never yielding to him either. Henry, once so fond of More's mind, now saw it as a threat, an obstacle to the unchallenged legitimacy of his reign and new church. To maintain control, the king needed not just obedience but consent, preferably from those whose reputations carried weight. In 1535, the situation reached its tragic conclusion. More was tried for treason on the grounds that he had denied the king's supremacy, even if he had never said it aloud. The court's verdict was a foregone conclusion. More was sentenced to death, a public execution meant to serve as a warning to others who might dare place conscience above crown. On July 6, 1535, Thomas More was beheaded on Tower Hill. In his final words, he declared, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." It was a statement of profound loyalty and profound defiance. Even in death, More refused to relinquish the moral autonomy that had defined his life. Henry, meanwhile, continued to consolidate power, reshaping the religious and political fabric of England in his own image. But the execution of More cast a long shadow. a reminder that even friends could become enemies when principle stood in the way of power. More's legacy did not die with him. Over the centuries, he would be venerated as a martyr of conscience, canonized by the Catholic Church, and immortalized in literature and film. To many, he represented the ultimate moral counterpoint to Henry's unchecked ambition. Yet his story also reveals the painful reality of Tudor rule, that loyalty was conditional and justice was defined by the whims of a single man. Henry VIII, for all his brilliance and charisma, demanded absolute allegiance. Those who failed to give it, no matter how revered or reasonable, were swept aside by the force of his will. The fall of Thomas More was not just a personal tragedy. It was a turning point in England as transformation from a kingdom of shared religious heritage to one where the monarch reigned supreme in both temporal and spiritual matters. It signaled the rise of a new kind of ruler, one who saw divine authority not as a limit, but as a crown to be seized and worn. Henry's myth would be built on such moments of breakage, betrayal, and brutal certainty. And in the quiet courage of Thomas More, we glimpse the cost of standing still while the world changes around you. Part 7. The Pilgrimage of Grace. Rebellion against the King's Reformation. Henry VIII. The King, the Man, the Myth. In 1536, England erupted in one of the largest uprisings of Henry VIII's reign. It wasn't sparked by foreign invasion or noble rivalry, but by the King's own sweeping religious reforms. Known as the Pilgrimage of Grace, this rebellion began in the north and quickly swelled into a movement that brought tens of thousands of ordinary men into defiant procession. They marched under the banners of the 5 Wounds of Christ, cloaking their political protest in the language of piety. To them, the king had become a heretic, a destroyer of churches, and an oppressor of the faithful. The north of England was especially vulnerable to unrest. Far from the royal court, its people were deeply loyal to the old ways of Catholic worship. Monasteries had long been integral to their communities, offering education, aid, and spiritual guidance. But under Henry's rule, those sacred institutions were being dismantled at an alarming pace. The king's dissolution of the monasteries, led by his minister Thomas Cromwell, stripped away not only land and wealth but also centuries of religious tradition. Villagers watched in horror as abbots were driven out, relics destroyed, and holy sites plundered for royal coffers. The change wasn't just spiritual, it was economic and social. Monasteries had provided food to the poor, shelter to travelers, and employment to countless workers. Their destruction left gaping holes in the fabric of northern life, and resentment smoldered into action. In October 1536, a lawyer named Robert Ascey emerged as the unlikely leader of what would become a formidable movement. Ascey was no reckless zealot. He believed in reason, order, and negotiation. Under his guidance, the rebels declared their cause not to overthrow the king, but to restore the realm's spiritual foundation and seek justice for the people. They called themselves pilgrims, not traitors, and insisted they remained loyal to Henry. But they demanded the end of Cromwell's influence, the restoration of the monasteries, and the reversal of unpopular taxes and laws. The sheer scale of the uprising stunned the royal court. Over 30,000 men took part, far outnumbering the forces available to the crown in the region. Instead of immediate repression, Henry chose a more cunning response. He offered negotiations and promises, sending envoys to speak with Ascey and hear the pilgrims' grievances. The rebels, believing in the king's honor, accepted the terms and agreed to disband peacefully. But Henry had no intention of honoring his promises. Once the rebels returned to their homes and laid down their arms, the king struck. Leaders were arrested, including Ascey, and show trials were held to set an example. In 1537, Robert Ascey was executed, hanged in chains from the walls of Clifford's Tower in York. Hundreds more faced similar fates as Henry exacted vengeance under the pretense of law and loyalty. The North was brought brutally to heel. The Pilgrimage of Grace revealed the depth of resistance to Henry's reforms. It exposed the cultural and regional divides within England, between a court driven by reform and a countryside anchored in faith and tradition. But it also marked a shift in how dissent would be treated under Henry's rule. No longer would the crown tolerate collective protest, however peaceful or devout. The king's authority was not to be questioned, not by rebels, not by nobles, not by clergy. Henry's suppression of the uprising sent a chilling message throughout the realm. To oppose him, even with noble intentions, was to invite ruin. His reign would continue to see the steady erosion of traditional power structures, religious and local alike, in favor of centralized royal command. While the Reformation had its ideological roots in theological debate, in Henry's hands it became an instrument of control. The king had turned spiritual upheaval into political opportunity, and any resistance to that vision was met with swift, merciless force. In the aftermath, many in the North felt betrayed, not just by Henry's broken promises, but by the realization that their king no longer served as protector of their faith. The myth of a benevolent monarch gave way to the reality of an autocrat cloaked in divine right. And yet, Henry's power grew, not diminished, in the wake of the rebellion. He tightened his grip on church and state, wielding both with an authority that few English kings had ever commanded before. The Pilgrimage of Grace became a cautionary tale, a reminder that under Henry VIII, loyalty was a sword that cut both ways. Part 8. Henry's obsession with legacy, the quest for a male heir. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. For Henry VIII, kingship was never just about ruling the present. It was about securing the future. From the earliest days of his reign, the specter of legacy loomed over his court like a shadow cast by history itself. Dynastic survival was the ultimate mark of a successful monarch, and Henry, haunted by the memory of civil war during the Wars of the Roses, was determined to preserve Tudor stability through a male heir. He believed that only a son could cement the Tudor line, prevent rebellion and protect England from descending into chaos. When Catherine of Aragon failed to provide him with a surviving male child, Henry's desperation deepened into obsession. Their daughter Mary, though bright and devout, was not the son he needed in a world where queens ruling alone were rare and often considered weak or illegitimate. Henry's fear was not merely political, it was almost existential. He saw his masculinity, his divine favor, and his royal destiny bound up in the need to produce a healthy male successor. The failure of sons to live long after birth gnawed at his confidence, raising superstitions and theological anxieties about whether his marriage to Catherine was cursed. Henry turned increasingly to scripture to justify his desire for annulment. He clung to a passage in Leviticus that warned of childlessness for a man who married his brother's widow. To Henry, this was not coincidence. It was divine judgment. Though Catherine insisted that her marriage to Arthur, Henry's elder brother, had never been consummated, Henry chose not to believe her. What had once been a secure marriage, celebrated across Europe, now became, in Henry's eyes, a dangerous defiance of God's will. Thus began the long and bitter campaign to annul his first marriage, which would ultimately reshape English history. When the Pope refused to grant his annulment, Henry did the unthinkable. He broke with Rome, casting aside the authority of the papacy that had ruled Christian Europe for centuries. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, a radical move not only driven by theological reasoning, but by personal ambition and dynastic need. The schism from Rome was not born solely of reformist zeal. It was the desperate act of a king who would upend a millennium of religious order to secure a son. His marriage to Anne Boleyn in 1533 brought with it promise and danger in equal measure. Anne quickly became pregnant, and both she and Henry were confident a prince was on the way. But the child born to them was another daughter, Elizabeth. Though Elizabeth would one day prove to be one of England's greatest monarchs, in that moment, her birth was a bitter disappointment to Henry. Anne's subsequent miscarriages only deepened the king's frustration and suspicion, leading eventually to her arrest and execution. When Jane Seymour gave birth to a son, Edward, in 1537, Henry finally had what he long desired. The boy's birth was greeted with celebrations across the realm. Jane, however, died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry both triumphant and widowed. Edward was christened with all the grandeur of royal tradition, hailed as the prince who would continue the Tudor line and secure Henry's place in history. For a brief time, Henry's obsession seemed fulfilled. But Edward's frail health would soon rekindle the old anxieties. Even as Henry married again, 3 more times, none of his later wives would provide him with another living son. Henry's quest for legacy had cost him dearly: a fractured kingdom, a broken relationship with his daughter Mary, and a reputation for ruthlessness. And still he could not fully shake the fear that the Tudor dynasty remained vulnerable. Despite the elaborate pageants, the solemn prayers, and the carefully choreographed court rituals, Henry remained a man haunted by the fragility of male succession. In his later years, Henry lavished attention on his son Edward, giving him the best tutors and preparing him to rule as a Protestant prince. Yet even then, he began to consider the potential of his daughters as political assets. In a significant move, he altered the line of succession to include both Mary and Elizabeth, though their legitimacy remained legally suspect. This was not a softening of heart, but a strategic recognition that the Tudor name had few heirs left. Legacy for Henry was no longer just about one son, but about securing a dynasty that could endure beyond his turbulent reign. Henry's pursuit of a male heir shaped nearly every decision he made. It fueled his break from Rome, the rise and fall of queens, the centralization of royal power, and the bloody purification of dissent. In many ways, it defined him more than any conquest or reform. He was a king ruled by a fear of mortality and the impermanence of power. And though Edward would ascend the throne, his reign would last only 6 years, an echo of the fragility Henry had always feared. Part 9. The Court of Henry VIII: Splendor, Surveillance, and Survival. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. At the heart of Henry VIII's monarchy was his glittering royal court, a place of pageantry, elegance, ruthless politics, and constant fear. It was more than a residence or a stage for formal ceremonies. It was a machine designed to amplify the king's image, display his divine authority, and maintain control over the nobility. Yet beneath the polished veneer of tapestries and trumpets, the court was also a dangerous theater of shifting alliances and invisible threats. Henry's court was deliberately grandiose. He surrounded himself with musicians, poets, scholars, soldiers, diplomats, and craftsmen who made his rule appear not only powerful, but cultured. Banquets lasted for hours with flowing wine, music, and elaborate dishes meant to awe visitors and subjects alike. Portraits commissioned by Henry emphasized his broad frame, commanding posture, and rich clothing, all reinforcing the narrative of an unshakable ruler. Holbein's iconic painting of Henry with wide legs, clenched fists, and fierce eyes is not simply art. It's propaganda in pigment. And the Tudors understood the value of image in the age before mass communication. Every procession, every masque, every joust was a message to the people. The king is strong, rich, chosen by God. But alongside this theater of power existed another realm, one ruled by whispers, spies, and informants. The court was as much a palace of paranoia as it was a symbol of splendor. To survive in Henry's court, one needed more than noble blood. You had to understand courtly etiquette, master the art of flattery, and know when to speak and when to remain silent. Favorites rose swiftly, but could fall faster than they rose. One day you might be basking in the glow of royal favor, and the next you could be imprisoned in the Tower on charges of treason or heresy. The court under Henry VIII demanded absolute loyalty, and even that wasn't always enough. Thomas More, once a close confidant and Lord Chancellor, learned this the hard way. Though he had served Henry faithfully for years, his refusal to accept the king's supremacy over the church led to his execution. Anne Boleyn, the woman for whom Henry broke from Rome, was publicly adored at first, but later condemned and beheaded. Even Thomas Cromwell, Henry's brilliant chief minister and architect of the Reformation, fell from grace and was executed after arranging the king's failed marriage to Anne of Cleves. In Henry's court, success was a double-edged sword. It elevated and endangered in equal measure. Court factions constantly vied for influence over the king. The Boleyn faction clashed with conservative Catholics, loyal to Catherine of Aragon. Later, reformist Protestants competed with traditionalists for access to Henry's ear, especially as his religious policies wavered between reform and orthodoxy. These rivalries weren't merely academic, they could determine life or death. Many nobles maintained spies among their servants, and even in other households to anticipate shifts in royal favor. The court also acted as a microcosm of Henry's ambitions for England. It hosted ambassadors from across Europe and projected England as a cultured, powerful kingdom in the Renaissance world. Scholars and humanists like Erasmus visited and corresponded with courtiers, while Henry himself dabbled in poetry, music, and theology. These intellectual pursuits weren't purely hobbies, they were tools of diplomacy and image building. They helped to place England among the great courts of Europe, alongside France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Despite its glamour, life at court was precarious for women in particular. Queens were expected to be paragons of virtue, loyalty, and fertility, and failure in any category could lead to disgrace or death. Ladies-in-waiting could gain favor and status, or attract the king's gaze and risk becoming pawns in the dangerous game of succession and seduction. Even Jane Seymour, who gave Henry the son he desperately wanted, knew she was only safe so long as she remained useful or virtuous in the king's eyes. For those who fell out of favor, there was often no redemption, only exile, imprisonment, or execution. Palaces like Hampton Court and Whitehall were the grand stages upon which this drama unfolded. They were designed not only for comfort, but for surveillance, allowing Henry to observe his courtiers and assert his dominance. Access to the king was tightly controlled and highly coveted, with proximity equating to power. The Privy Chamber, an inner sanctum of male courtiers, became one of the most influential political arenas, where decisions were made beyond the eyes of formal councils. Those who entered it did so with both privilege and peril. Henry VIII's court was a paradox, lavish yet lethal, cultured yet cutthroat. It was the core of Tudor power, reflecting both the king's majesty and his mercurial temper. Here, the myth of the monarch was crafted daily through ritual, surveillance, flattery, and fear. It was where loyalty was rewarded, but also where the slightest misstep could lead to ruin. And at its center stood Henry, ever watchful, ever demanding, and always conscious that he must be seen as both man and God-appointed king. Part 10. Religious Revolution, Henry's Church and the Shattered Faith. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. The English Reformation did not begin as a movement of faith, but as an act of royal necessity. At the heart of Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church was his desire for a male heir, and the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But once the thread was pulled, the entire tapestry of English religious life began to unravel. Henry's creation of the Church of England marked not only a spiritual shift, but a political earthquake that would reshape the nation's future. The act that initiated this rupture was the Act of Supremacy in 1534. This law declared Henry supreme head of the Church of England, severing the Pope's influence in English affairs. It was a bold and unprecedented assertion of royal authority, one that placed the monarch above even the bishops in spiritual matters. Though he remained Catholic in doctrine for much of his life, Henry now wielded spiritual power alongside his political might. At first, many English people didn't fully grasp the consequences of this shift. The rituals continued, churches still held Mass, and the liturgy remained familiar. But Henry's motives were never purely theological. They were deeply personal and dynastic. He wanted his marriage to Catherine voided so he could marry Anne Boleyn, hoping she would bear him a son. When the Pope denied his request, Henry used Parliament and his own legal advisors to sidestep the papacy entirely. The dissolution of the monasteries was perhaps the most disruptive aspect of this religious revolution. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry ordered the systematic closure and destruction of England's monasteries, priories, convents and friaries. These institutions had been spiritual centers, economic hubs, and providers of charity and education for centuries. Their loss was felt deeply across the land, particularly by the poor who relied on monastic alms and hospitals. But Henry's motives were not just about faith, they were also financial. The crown seized enormous amounts of wealth, land, gold, silver, and relics from the religious houses. This influx of riches helped fund military campaigns and shore up royal finances, giving Henry unprecedented economic power. It also allowed him to reward loyal nobles with lands, strengthening their allegiance to the Tudor regime. The destruction of monastic culture wasn't merely physical, it was intellectual and spiritual. Libraries were scattered, ancient texts destroyed or sold, and centers of learning were extinguished. Priests and monks who resisted the changes were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. One of the most high-profile victims was John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, who refused to recognize Henry's supremacy and was beheaded for his defiance. For the English people, the change was bewildering. Yet in some regions there were violent uprisings, such as the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, where thousands marched in protest of the religious changes and the dissolution of the monasteries. They demanded a return to the old ways and the reinstatement of Catholic institutions. Henry responded with brutal suppression, executing the leaders and stamping out the rebellion with ruthless efficiency. Henry's relationship with religion remained complex throughout his reign. Despite the break with Rome, he resisted many Protestant reforms. He authorized the publication of the English Bible in 1539, but also passed the 6 Articles in the same year, reaffirming traditional Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation and clerical celibacy. Those who veered too far toward Protestantism were punished, just as those who clung too tightly to Catholicism were persecuted. Religious policy under Henry was not a straight line. It zigzagged with his personal needs and shifting political alliances. The creation of the Church of England gave rise to new institutions and roles within society. Archbishops and bishops now served not just God but the crown, operating under royal authority. Parliament gained influence in ecclesiastical matters, blurring the line between secular and sacred power. Clergy were forced to navigate a treacherous new world where doctrine could change with the king's mood or marriage. The average parishioner caught between these forces often chose quiet conformity. But in private, many continued their old devotions, prayed to saints and whispered forbidden Latin prayers behind closed doors. England had become a land of outward obedience and inward confusion. People feared denunciation, surveillance, and sudden arrests, especially as new laws made it treasonous to question the king's religious authority. By the end of Henry's reign, England was neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant. It was a hybrid, one man's invention to suit his personal desires, fortified by political necessity and enforced by violence. The religious landscape was fragmented, uncertain, and ripe for further upheaval in the years to come. But Henry had achieved what he wanted: control over his kingdom's soul as well as its body. This religious revolution was not born of ideology or scriptural enlightenment. It was crafted from ambition, obsession, and the will to dominate every sphere of life. And though later monarchs would push the Reformation further, it was Henry who opened the floodgates, forever changing the faith of a nation. Part 11. War, Wealth, and Decline. The later years of a wounded king. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. In the final decade of Henry VIII's reign, the glorious vigor of his youth faded into a more somber portrait of power. The once athletic monarch who jousted with pride and danced with elegance became a bloated, immobile figure, tormented by disease, regret, and paranoia. The transformation was not merely physical. It was a reflection of years of unchecked ambition, personal betrayals, and national strife. Yet even as his body failed him, Henry's hunger for war, wealth, and dominance never waned. Henry's later military ambitions turned increasingly toward France and Scotland. Though once allied through marriage and diplomacy, these nations became targets of renewed aggression. The king's desire to reclaim lost glory, rival François I of France, and avenge Scottish defiance drove him into costly and largely futile conflicts. In 1544, he personally led a campaign into France, capturing Boulogne, a symbolic but minor victory that cost a fortune and left little long-term impact. Scotland, too, suffered under Henry's wrath. Following the death of James V of Scotland, Henry sought to secure control by arranging a marriage between his son Edward and the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. When the Scots resisted, he unleashed a campaign known as the Rough Wooing, a brutal scorched earth policy aimed at forcing compliance through terror and devastation. Castles were razed, villages burned, and countless lives disrupted in a war that yielded no clear success. Henry's military ventures, once rooted in youthful glory, now served only to drain his treasury and further destabilize the realm. To fund these wars, Henry turned to increasingly desperate economic strategies. The wealth seized from the monasteries during the dissolution had long since been spent or gifted to loyal nobles. He debased the coinage, reducing the amount of precious metal in English currency, which triggered inflation and economic uncertainty across the kingdom. Land sales and forced loans became common, burdening both gentry and merchants with the cost of Henry's unrelenting ambitions. Though, even as he strained England's resources abroad, Henry's domestic life was no less turbulent. He married 3 more times after executing Anne Boleyn and losing Jane Seymour to childbirth. Anne of Cleves, a political match, was quickly annulled. Catherine Howard, young and spirited, was executed for alleged adultery. His final wife, Catherine Parr, proved wise and diplomatic, managing both his children and his temper with cautious skill. By the early 1540s, Henry's health had deteriorated significantly. He suffered from chronic leg ulcers, likely stemming from a jousting injury sustained in 1536, which never fully healed. These wounds grew infected, oozing and foul, leaving him in constant pain and increasingly immobile. Obesity plagued him. Some reports suggest he weighed over 300 pounds in his final years. He was carried about on specially constructed chairs and struggled to move without assistance. But despite his physical decline, Henry's authority remained absolute. He still commanded fear and obedience, and his courtiers tread carefully around a monarch whose wrath could turn deadly in an instant. He remained deeply involved in matters of state, issuing orders, reshuffling ministers, and dictating royal policy from his chambers. Behind closed doors, however, he grew more isolated, paranoid, and distrustful of those closest to him. Henry's court in his later years was a place of intrigue and survival. Factions rose and fell depending on the king's mood and perceived loyalties. The Protestant reformers and Catholic traditionalists fought for influence, using Henry's favor as both weapon and shield. One day's ally could be the next day's traitor. Men like Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Bishop Stephen Gardiner navigated this dangerous terrain with both skill and fear. Toward the end of his reign, Henry grew increasingly concerned with his legacy and succession. His long-desired male heir, Edward, had been born at last in 1537, but remained a sickly child. Fearing a power struggle upon his death, Henry sought to secure the line of succession by passing the Third Succession Act in 1543. This act restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line, though they remained legally illegitimate. It was a final effort to preserve stability in a realm he had so often disrupted. When Henry VIII had died on January 28, 1547, he left behind a fractured and uncertain kingdom. His body, ravaged by illness, was interred at St. George's Chapel beside Jane Seymour, the one wife he claimed to have truly loved. Few wept openly. His death was as much a release as a loss. The man who had redefined kingship through force, charisma, and brutality now passed into legend. What remained was a kingdom rich in change, but poor in cohesion. He had broken the power of the Pope, destroyed ancient institutions, and redrawn the political and spiritual map of England. But he had also impoverished the crown, alienated allies, and left behind a child king whose reign would bring its own chaos. The decline of Henry VIII was not just the fading of a man, it was the dimming of an age marked by violence, ambition, and monumental transformation. Part 12. Legacy of a Giant, the Legend and the Lies of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, the king, the man, the myth. In death, Henry VIII became larger than life. His reign ended in blood and grandeur, but what followed was a transformation of a man into a myth, a myth. For centuries, his name echoed across Europe as the epitome of tyrannical majesty, a monarch of towering presence, indomitable will, and dangerous unpredictability. Yet behind the stories and portraits lay contradictions that few dared to question, until the modern era re-examined the layers of myth wrapped around the man. Henry's physical image, immortalized in Hans Holbein's iconic portrait, became the face of absolute monarchy. Broad-shouldered, bearded, standing in defiant grandeur, the painting projected strength, masculinity, and command. This was no accident. It was deliberate propaganda. Henry wanted to be remembered as a king above all kings, chosen by God and unchallengeable by man. The reality was far more complex. Beneath that imposing surface lived a deeply insecure ruler, obsessed with legacy, terrified of rebellion and haunted by failure. Much of his aggression, particularly in matters of marriage and religion, stemmed from personal vulnerability rather than supreme confidence. His need for a male heir drove many of his cruelest decisions, including executions and annulments that left scars across the English psyche. The myth of the virile, unstoppable king ignored the broken marriages, the dying children, and the ghosts of those sacrificed to his ambition. In popular memory, Henry VIII is remembered above all for his 6 wives. This fixation, while sensational, oversimplifies the man and the era. He was more than a womanizer or a paranoid husband. He was a reformer, a strategist, a lover of the arts, and a man capable of both generosity and astonishing cruelty. The myth often ignores the full scope of his personality, reducing him to a punchline about marital turnover. Religion remains one of the most hotly debated aspects of Henry's legacy. To many, he is the man who created the Church of England and severed ties with Rome. Yet he died a Catholic in belief, if not in allegiance. He defended traditional doctrine throughout much of his life and only tolerated Protestant reforms when they served his political needs. Modern historians now view his religious stance not as visionary, but as opportunistic, shaped by the needs of the moment, not spiritual awakening. Politically, Henry reshaped the monarchy into a more centralized and personal form of rule, VIII. He expanded the power of the crown, curtailed the influence of the nobility, and laid the groundwork for a modern bureaucratic state. His court became a hub of administration, diplomacy, and law, blending personal rule with institutional strength. This legacy endured. Future monarchs operated within a system that he had redefined, even if they resisted his example. Culturally, the Tudor court under Henry VIII flourished in the Renaissance spirit. He was a patron of music, architecture, and scholarship. He founded Trinity College, Cambridge, and supported the Royal Navy's development, shaping England's maritime future. Though not always personally intellectual, he valued the arts as a tool of power and identity. His court became a place where poets, artists, and scholars advanced both knowledge and the image of a glorious monarchy. Economically, his reign left behind a mixed inheritance. Though the crown amassed wealth through the dissolution of the monasteries, it squandered much of it in war and displays of royal magnificence. The debasement of currency and sale of crown lands left future monarchs financially strained. Yet he also reformed certain tax systems and enhanced trade links, contributing to long-term shifts in the English economy. His economic policies, like his personality, were contradictory, at times visionary, at others reckless. Henry's image also underwent transformation over time. In the Elizabethan age, he was remembered fondly as the father of Gloriana, the warrior queen who ruled with grace and wisdom. Victorian historians saw him as a moral warning, a cautionary tale about unchecked desire and patriarchal excess. Modern interpretations swing between admiration for his boldness and condemnation of his brutality. The myth, it seems, continues to evolve. Today, Henry VIII occupies a space between fact and fiction, reality and theatre. He is dramatized in films, parodied in television, dissected in books, and endlessly debated by scholars and the public alike. His wives have inspired musicals, his court has filled museum halls, and his life continues to shape how we view monarchy itself. Rarely does a historical figure become both villain and hero, fool and genius, icon and warning. Perhaps the most enduring part of the myth is that it cannot be easily untangled from the man. Every time we attempt to define Henry VIII, tyrant, reformer, lover, killer, we are met with another side of him that defies the label. His contradictions are what keep him fascinating. They are also what make him so deeply human. In the end, Henry VIII's legacy is not just in the laws he passed, the battles he fought, or the women he married. It lies in the questions he forces us to ask about power, identity, loyalty, and the cost of greatness. Was he a hero of English independence or a destroyer of sacred tradition? A king of strength or a man ruled by weakness? The answer, as always with Henry, lies somewhere in between. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life and legend of Henry VIII. From the ambitions of a young prince to the enduring legacy of a mythologized monarch, we've explored the man behind the mask. History may never fully agree on who Henry truly was, but his story remains as compelling today as it was 5 centuries ago. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold royal stories and historical deep dives. Until next time, keep questioning the past because history is never finished.